everyone, before watching this video, if you could just make sure that you have read the article on Philip Larkin, which should be labelled as number 1 on our Google Classroom. I'm not going to read this poem, but I just want you to see that I've placed Philip Larkin's I Remember side by side with Thomas Hood's I Remember, because Larkin deliberately took inspiration from this and used the same title. Because Thomas Hood's poem is a nostalgic reflection on childhood, whereas his poem, he reflects on the fact that actually he holds absolutely no nostalgia whatsoever for his childhood. In fact, he seems almost disassociated with it. So if you want to read it, you can pause the screen or you can look at the PDF that I'll attach. It's up to you. And now we're going to move on to some other context that is separate from the stuff that you read in the article. So, Philip Larkin was a British poet born in 1922 in Coventry, a city which was badly damaged in World War II by the Nazis during the Blitz. Which means that actually the Coventry that he remembers is vastly different from the Coventry that he actually sees on his train journey in the poem. Throughout his life, he worked as a librarian after graduating with a first-class honours in English from Oxford at university libraries, including a period spent at Queen's University Belfast. He never married, however, throughout his life he had several relationships with women, even married ones. He was a fan of jazz, and later on in his career in 1961 he became a jazz critic for the Daily Telegraph. Due to his personal views of distaste towards fame, Larkin avoided a public literary life, so he was quite reclusive. He's also known for his cynical and sometimes critical attitude to modern life. He died in 1985, and comments in private letters discovered after his death have presented him in a less than favourable way to the modern reader. Larkin's early childhood was in some respects unusual. He was educated at home until the age of 8 by his mother and sister. Neither friends nor relatives ever visited the family home, and he developed a stammer. In his poetry and essays, Larkin remembers his early years as unspent and boring, as he grew up the son of a city treasurer in Coventry. Poor eyesight and stuttering plagued Larkin as a youth. He retreated into the solitude of reading widely and began to write poetry as a nightly routine. The poem I Remember was written after 1954, when he made a surprise visit with a friend, and unpleasant memories of his childhood home in Coventry are explored, and he reflects on all the things that his childhood was not. He's quoted as having said, "An odd little chronicle of non-events that happened, or rather didn't happen, in a place that no longer exists. The city was just another place where nothing ever happened, a forgotten boredom." Now, I know that you read the context essay before watching this video or downloading the PDF and reading it, but I have found some more really good websites or extracts from books, and I thought that they were really interesting and gave you a very firm sense of his character. So we've got some extended context here. The first one is taken from a Guardian article called "That's Enough Larkin About." Philip Larkin's father kept a statuette of Hitler on the drawing room mantelpiece. You would press a button and its right arm shot up in a Nazi salute. Little wonder then that Larkin, the poet laureate of provincial melancholy, had grim memories of his childhood home in Coventry, says the writer of this Guardian article. He said it was a very gloomy house and unhappy place, says Peter Walters, who works for Coventry and Warwickshire Promotions, which is hoping to reclaim a bit of Larkin back from Hull, where as university librarian, the poet famously contemplated the world of bedsits, bicycle clips, and bored disappointment. His father had a tyrannical personality, his mother crept around like a ghost, and it coloured all his childhood and his subsequent view of this city. So, if the theme of place were to come up, and how place influences identity, here we can see that actually for Larkin it doesn't. When he revisits Coventry, it does nothing to remind him of his childhood identity. It does nothing to remind him of nostalgic childhood memories, because actually he just feels this kind of emptiness and this kind of sense of boredom and monotony. If it's about journeys, unlike Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken, there's nothing profound in this journey. If you want to look at it on how childhood shapes your identity, again, unlike the likes of, Simon Armitage's Kid, or unlike maybe even things such as genetics or Catherine, we have this sense that he doesn't view his childhood identity as an extension of who he is today, that it's a separate identity, which I think is really interesting. Then if we move on to cprw.com, they have said, the poem's enumeration of cliched notions of happiness also recalls Larkin's scorching tally of dusty platitudes about poetic childhoods in the poem. I remember, written just several weeks earlier in this poem, the narrator visiting his Coventry birthplace with a friend, Riley lists all the things that didn't occur in his decidedly unwordsworthy childhood. He did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits. There was no farm where I could be really myself, and at no point did he lie down with a young lady, all becoming a burning mist. So basically, these memories that we have of childhood, of it being really happy, a really wonderful time, something where you have all these fantastic, life-altering, coming-of-age experiences, there's none of that. That actually for him there's just emptiness, which is a bit grim. Then in Philip Larkin, Life, Art and Love, on page 188, we're told, I remember the 8th of January 1954 blasphemes against his former Laurentian faith, debunking the depiction of childhood in novels like Sons and Lovers, where the poet's train stops at Coventry, where he was born. The poet is at a loss. The childhood the books tell him he should remember never occurred. Coventry, he concludes, is not where he has his roots, only where his childhood was unspent. His passionate denials become comic, and his companion protests, "You look as if you wished the place in hell." But beneath the plain speaking there are complications. Though the poem is divided into stanzas of 5 lines, the rhyme scheme implies a 9-line unit, and Larkin claimed preposterously that this playful subversion was quite accidental, really. The final line required to complete the scheme resonates perplexingly in the mind. Nothing like something happens anywhere. At first, the words seem merely a glum verdict on the poet's childhood, but they transcend their context and haunt the reader like a Wittgensteinian puzzle. The impact of this apparently prosaic work is intensely poetic. So, in other words, to translate that for you, he doesn't use flowery, poetic language. He doesn't talk about really profound things. He talks about the mundane, the normal, the everyday, the sometimes disappointing and depressing. And he debunks this idea that, your childhood must be happy, as well as this idea that your childhood defines who you will become as an adult. We can also see that unlike poems such as Seamus Heaney's Docker or Kieran Carson's Belfast Confetti, that he doesn't feel like place does define him. Unlike the Docker, who is defined by the sectarianism rife within the Harlan and Wolff shipyard, or the unnamed speaker who we assume is based on Carson's own experiences in Belfast during the Troubles, he doesn't feel like his identity is being assumed because of where he is in Belfast. So for him, Coventry has no bearing on who he has become today and the identity that he now holds, which I think is really interesting. As for Wittgensteinian puzzle, so Wittgenstein was this really famous philosopher, and he is responsible for creating what's known as a Wittgensteinian puzzle, a language game, which is a philosophical concept referring to simple examples of language use and the actions into which the language is woven. Wittgenstein argued that a word or even a sentence has meaning only as a result of the rule of the game being played. So that hopefully made sense to you. But if you're still a little bit confused, that's okay, because some of this stuff has been taken from scholarly articles and it's maybe more so at like a university standard. Although hopefully you got something useful from it and something worthy that you can use in an essay. That will set your essay apart from other people's and really impress the examiner. If we look at the situation in the poem contains the passing thoughts of a speaker as he sees his hometown of Coventry from a train. The poem begins with the speaker and his friend arriving briefly in Coventry. They're on their way somewhere else and they are stopped at the platform. The speaker looks around, hoping to see something he recognises but doesn't, and this fact does not surprise him as Coventry was never really a home to him. The rest of the poem is devoted to describing things that didn't happen to the speaker. He has in his mind an idealised version of what childhood should be. He also knows that this childhood did not match up with his own experience. The speaker did not have close family friends, spend happy hours in the garden, or have his early written work appreciated by someone. These factors add up to an unhappy childhood that the speaker's friend questions him about, and the poem concludes with the speaker saying it wasn't Coventry's fault he was unhappy, as he probably would have been unhappy anywhere. So that maybe says quite a lot about parental life, and that's probably why he's famed at having written probably his most famous work, This Be the Verse, which opens with the line, I'm going to change one word here, they mess you up, your mum and dad. There's actually an expletive in there somewhere, and it is an exceptionally famous poem. So you can see that actually throughout his work, you can see this idea of having a really troubled childhood and how his parents and their influence did not support what he feels was a healthy identity for him. And is it any wonder when his father had a statue of Hitler in a room in their house? I think that kind of really probably says it all. Anyway, the significance of the title, I Remember, suggests that it's self-reflective and that's about a memory. So you might be asked about how memories are important in shaping our identity, and you might be asked to compare this poem to something like D.H. Lawrence's Piano, which is all about sensory memory. So there's quite a lot of poems that this one actually kind of pairs up with, and quite a lot of themes as well. The repetition evokes a sense of a nursery rhyme style and reinforces that this will be a poem about childhood. It also creates this kind of like cyclical element, suggesting the cyclical nature of returning to your hometown and bringing you back to your childhood. Except for most people, this is nostalgic, it's lovely, whereas for him, it's not. It also calls to mind another poem with the same title, which has connotations of childhood. This is the well-known poem by English poet Thomas Hood. However, unlike Hood's obsession with the meaningfulness of childhood, Larkin shows an honest statement of an unhappy childhood. Where Hood's poem evokes a sense of whimsy and nostalgia, Larkin's is the opposite and instead is a grim portrayal of a disappointing childhood. Then if we look at form and structure, it's an 8-stanza poem. Stanzas 1 to 7 are quintians, and it reflects the sense of going on a journey. Then the last line, this final stanza, is a single line, and it's set out on its own separately for emphasis and highlights the anticlimactic nature of the final words. It has an A-B-C-C-B rhyme scheme, exaggerating the events that didn't happen but are considered supposedly normal. It has the point of view of an adult reflecting on childhood, but not wistful like Thomas Hood's poem of the same name. Hood's poem is concerned with the meaningfulness of events, so the poem contradicts our expectations. And he is playing on that name and that title as well. There's this kind of reluctance to revisit the past, but he does have a conversational tone further through the enjambment. And this reluctance probably stems from the dissatisfaction and disdain with his childhood, which he conveys throughout the poem. And now we're going to move on to a line-by-line analysis. So I have tried to make this fit into different stanzas just so you can actually see that each box is representative of a stanza. Because I thought that if I did a line-by-line analysis, it would just be too confusing and it might skew the structure for you. So, coming up England by a different line, for once early in the cold new year, we stopped and watching men with number plates sprint down the platform to familiar gates. "Why, Coventry!" I exclaimed. "I was born here." So the poem places him instantly as merely a passenger on a train. Unlike journeys such as Carson's and Belfast Confetti and Frost's The Road Not Taken, the poet feels that the journey is unimportant and inconsequential to his identity, and I think that's really important because it's an accidental journey as well, unlike the choices that we make in Robert Frost's journeys. The ideal country experience offers no satisfaction for him, unlike Hood's nostalgic escapism. So if you want to read the Hood poem, this will really help you understand this poem. And he seems almost indifferent. There's a really strong sense of setting created though. To familiar gates creates this kind of false aura of nostalgia until the next stanza through the use of quotation marks and direct speech. And this illustrates this sudden outburst of memory. And you've got this hollowness to his words to emphasise the detachment through that "I was born here" as well. And sorry, this illustrates is meant to be in yellow, as is quotation marks direct speech. Then if we move on, "I leant far out and squinnied for a sign that this was still the town that had been mine. So long but found I wasn't even clear which side was which from where those cycle crates were standing had we annually departed." So the sibilant "squinnied for a sign" emphasises the detached, impartial attitude for childhood, or to his own childhood, and he feels like he is merely an observer. He doesn't recognise the place, and your context tells you why. And the colloquial language of "squinnied" emphasises the conversational tone, and in many ways this suggests that our childhood identities actually don't define who we become as adults as we get older. Mine, the possessive pronoun, emphasises his detachment and he feels no connection to this past. And I think that's really reinforced through the verb "squinnied" as well. This idea that, he's hunting, searching for some sort of connection, but it's just not there. And it also could be a reference to that, that poor vision that he suffered from as well. Which side was which? So this symbolises his confusion that having your hometown bombed to smithereens brings, and a sense of disappointment that he does not recognise it. Sometimes people want to feel these things about their childhood. They want to have this sense of nostalgia. And the alliteration "cycle creates" emphasises his confusion and distance. And then we have "for all those family halls, a whistle went, things moved. I sat back staring at my boots. Was that," my friend smiled, "where you have your roots?" "No, only where my childhood was unspent," I wanted to retort, "just where I started." So you've got this colloquial language of halls, which furthers the conversational tone as he recounts supposed memories to his friends. You've got the question mark and the ellipses, emphasising that uncertainty again, and it reinforces that his hometown is so changed from the Coventry which he remembers that he can't actually recall his childhood identity properly. Is he suggesting that place is a massive part of identity, and if the place changes then we lose a part of our identities? I don't know. Then you've got your alliteration of "whistle went," which creates oral imagery and breaks his reverie. The choice of diction and the short dramatic sentence furthers his feelings of uncertainty as well. Things moved. This idea that, things move on, that we move on, and that we don't hold on to certain things. Then we have "I sat back staring at my boots." So the sibilants, sat, staring, boots, even this at the end there, emphasises this sense of disappointment, this disconnect. Where you have your roots, so that's a colloquial reference to ancestry. And then he says, "My childhood was unspent," and he talks about wanting to retort. So the use of the possessive pronoun emphasises his detachment. He has no sense of connection. I mean, he wants to, but he doesn't. He doesn't connect to his past. He had a boring childhood and he feels like he didn't have a lot of rites of passage or coming of age experiences, conventional experiences, and he has a somewhat bitter tone about this, as shown through the wording choice there of retort, almost as if he's bitter at his friend for bringing it up. And then the next stanza. By now I've got the whole place clearly charted, our garden first where I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits, and wasn't spoken to by an old hat, and here we have that splendid family. So alliteration emphasises the mundane events that happened here, clearly charted. He contemplates each memory fleetingly. The verb choice suggests that this is a work of fiction and reiterates his disconnect from his childhood. Our garden first, so caesura emphasises the anticlimax. Allusions to Wordsworth, emphasising that he did not have a poetically beautiful or significant childhood when he talks about the blinding theologies of flower and fruit. And this is emphasised through the fricative alliteration in the F sounds. Old hat is a term usually used in place of relatives. So he didn't have, grandparents or, a great uncle chatting away and being supportive, and he doesn't have those lovely memories of friendly relatives laughing in the garden with him. Then if we move on to my next page and the next stanza, I never ran to when I got depressed, the boys all biceps and the girls all chest. They're comic forward, they're farm where I could be really myself. I'll show you come to that. The bracken where I never trembling sat. So he didn't have this supportive family. In fact, his family life had quite a lot of discord in it. He has all these passionate denials about things that he never did, and you've got this never kind of thing that creates an almost sense of comedic parody, and it is both humorous and tragic when you think about it, because he's got all these things that he never did that he feels are rites of passage, but as he protests about the fact that his childhood didn't contain this, they become more and more ridiculous, the things that he's saying. So boys all biceps, you've got alliteration, lamenting his lack of sexual experience as an adolescent. You've got that juxtaposition between the boys all biceps and the girls all chest. You've got this comic forward and a farm where you can really be yourself. So some children created an alternate reality, but not him. Further references to experiences of others emphasises the fact that his own memories are really mundane. He's got this cynical really myself in quotation marks here, and it's almost sarcastic to mock those people that, have a special place where they feel like they can really connect to. So he doesn't connect to the space, he doesn't connect to this location or setting at all in any way. He never had some sort of safe place that he could go to. So again, overall a disappointing childhood, and really reinforces that childhood isn't often the fond memories that we think of. The bracken where I never trembling sat, so you've got this inverted syntax, further emphasising the bland lack of excitement. It also kind of sounds almost Wordsworthian, or something like Keats would write as well. And then we're told, determined to go through with it, where she lay back and all became a burning mist. So you've got this consonant T sound and the euphemism of it for sexual experience that never actually happened. The allusion to the work of other poets and the alliteration became a burning creates a parody of overly romanticised poets such as Burns, Browning, Keats, who make experiences transcend to something profound. Sometimes experiences are just experiences, and sometimes they're disappointing. And the poet seems to be exploring his unconventional childhood and how the usual experiences did not happen to him, especially not in a town that he doesn't even recognise after it was attacked in the Blitz, suggesting that time and place are integral to identity, and if they both aren't combined, then identity is lost. And it also suggests that sometimes the experiences which really shape our identities are the things which actually didn't happen to us. You could also just assume that because these things didn't happen to him, then time and place isn't special. It needs to be combined with maybe the right memories. So there's lots of different readings and lots of different potential ways that you could interpret this poem. And in those offices, my doggerel was not set up in blunt 10-point nor read by a distinguished cousin of the mayor. So doggerel is a comic verse composed in irregular rhyme or verse, or words that are badly written. So he's alluding to the fact that, maybe you might write a story or a poem when you're a child, or maybe you want to paint a picture and your parents are so proud and they show it off to everyone, even if it is completely rubbish. And this pride that parents have in the work of their children, for example, the toddler with the artwork on the fridge, didn't actually happen to him. He never had someone supportive who would read his first attempts at poetry. He's not as gifted as other children who were maybe praised for their skills, with the reference to the distinguished cousin of the mayor, or maybe it's just that his parents weren't supportive people, who didn't call and tell my father there before us, "Had we the gift to see ahead? You look as though you wish the place in hell." My friend said, "Judging from your face, oh well, I suppose it's not the place's fault," I said. So again, you've got this further sense of disappointment. The dialogue interrupts his bitter lack of reminiscing. His childhood was bland and lacked excitement. And the disappointment is evident in, "I suppose it's not the place's fault." And then finally, nothing like something happens anywhere. So the juxtaposition of nothing and something and the caesura create this anticlimactic ending, emphasising the ordinariness of the whole experience. However, there is a lack of self-pity or sentimentality. And this is quite typical of Philip Larkin, actually, this kind of cynicism that comes with being an adult. And there's a kind of bittersweet irony here as well. He's not holding on to the fact that his childhood was rubbish because he doesn't feel the need to dwell upon it and let it shape him. He feels that childhood does not shape your identity, or at least that it doesn't have to. Finally, tone is conversational. There's definitely areas where it's exceptionally dissatisfied, cynical, bitter, and sentimental. Themes: childhood, memories, nostalgia, the past, journeys as well, I suppose, time, place. There's loads going on here, so it just depends on if this were to come up in an exam, what the actual key term of the question is, because as I've mentioned throughout this video, there's loads of stuff that you could pair it with. Alternatively, you need to be very careful if something else came up and you thought about pairing it with this, because there's so many themes. You want to make sure that there's enough to say about those themes. But we'll talk about that when we actually do more poems and we start writing our compare and contrast grids and churning out more essays.